In every video game that has something remotely resembling a health bar, you're bound to find a way for it to replenish just as you're expecting it to get depleted. Healing is one of the core concepts of combat, especially in RPGs and class-based titles, and despite rarely, if ever, taking the credit for a successful boss raid or dungeon clear, healers tend to be the sole determining factor for the outcome of said fight, and honestly deserve a lot more recognition for this supportive capability than the greater gaming community often gives them. Genshin's history with healers has been a very up and down one, literally. From being an appreciated staple in the beginning to having a quote-unquote dark age midway through the game's lifespan to now a total reversal in value compared to its main defensive rival mechanic shielding, among others of course. With Genshin currently undergoing a transformative period, I wanted to make a video talking about the rise and fall and rise again of healing characters, detailing the history of the class and the factors that led to such a rollercoaster journey for them. The start of Genshin Impact was without a doubt a Wild West period, with players having no semblance of understanding of the game or its characters at the time, and just navigating through the new foreign frontier as best they could with the resources they had. Version 1.0 had to have been the most hazardous time for players. The majority of us only had a few units to work with, and due to the limited accessibility of weapons and equipment, not to mention our characters hanging around low to mid level and thus not having full access to their abilities yet, we didn't do that much damage, but we were certainly taking a fair bit of damage. Large expansions of the map and areas to check out are made available on a frequent basis, but I still think, even if we disregard our more properly geared up characters, version 1 had the largest amount of content for us to explore in one sitting. After all, it did feature 2 entire countries at the same time, even if in the grand scheme of things, Mondstadt and Liyue are quite small compared to Sumeru. In terms of total exploration time, version 1 was definitely the most intensive. There were 2 universal forms of sustenance offered to us, recovering health by consuming food items or visiting a statue of the Seven, both of which were finite in nature. Unlike typical places to rest in other RPGs, lodges, Pokemon centers, and the like, statues of the Seven had a limited supply of healing at any given time and would take a while to regenerate, although usually no more than 20 to 25 minutes at most. The maximum health pool shared amongst all of them would depend on the number of statues you had unlocked, and while nowadays you have dozens made available throughout the 5 accessible regions of Teyvat, at the start there were only a handful for us to find, and so the health pool was a lot smaller. Granted, we had less max health at the time anyway. As for consumables, ingredients were not exactly difficult to come by, but depending on how much damage your party was taking by exploring, you would sooner exhaust your supply of rations than you could restock it. Not to mention, each unit could only eat so many food items in one sitting, expressed by their fullness gauge. The world level scaled based on adventure rank, so by no means do we have to fight a bunch of level 90 mobs with a ragtag group of 40s. Even so, players were hesitant on increasing world rank, specifically because of how difficult it would be for them to not only deal sufficient damage to enemies, but also withstand their increasing damage, which goes to show you that survival was of utmost priority in the early days of Genshin. Appropriately so, it is an open world RPG. This combination of circumstances made healers a class of paramount importance. No doubt everyone made copious use of whichever healer they could get their hands on, Noelle, Barbara, Bennett, although way early on, bear in mind we're still talking version 1.0, people still considered Bennett a bad character, so I don't remember if he was used for healing purposes at the time. A few lucky players who scored a copy of Jean or Chi-Chi had a far more comfortable time traversing the early game, marking probably the first and only time Chi-Chi was ever considered a desirable unit. There were so few options for cryo and healing at the time that I still remember she was placed in top tier in that one infamous day 1 tier list. With the absence of a mana or resource bar, healers were only restricted by cooldowns and energy costs, which could be self-sustained and replenished by participating in combat and regular activities. Much of the first half of version 1 oversaw teams consisting of a healer and 3 damage dealers, as that was the only thing players wanted at the time, and since virtually all featured units were comprised of damage dealers or non-curative supports, healers got to enjoy stable employment throughout the first year of the game. Version 2 would soon have that tested. Though signs of their waning usefulness appeared much earlier, it came to a head entering the second year of Genshin's release. Players were sufficiently geared up, statues had a larger stockpile of healing, and food items were made more and more plentiful, diminishing the necessity of healing in the overworld. Unless you were being deliberately careless, you would likely never face a scenario where your statue of the Seven was fully depleted, or you had to consume more healing items than your team could stomach. Not only that, but following the buffs to Zhongli as well as the introduction of more units, a second, more effective form of sustenance became widely used, shielding. Though it was primarily championed by the Geo Archon himself, 4-star units like Diona, Yanfei, Xinyan, and Toma saw fringe use for their defensive ability, offering a measurable advantage in this department. Additionally, with a full year of experience under our belts, the community's improved understanding of Genshin's combat enabled them to minimize damage taken while maximizing damage dealt, finding ways to either destroy the enemy wave fast enough to where they wouldn't get hit, or exploiting the invincibility frames afforded through the usage of elemental bursts. Quicksaw teams are growing more and more common as players finalize their characters' levels, talents, and equipment. It bears repeating that 99% of players in the early days of Genshin had no functional team comp, just one person out in front doing all the DPS. It wasn't until late version 1, early version 2 when the average player realized they could spam elemental bursts and kill everything that way. Back to shields though, there was a pretty big distinction to be made between healing and shielding. Shields in this game function the same way as in other games. They alleviate the need for healing by superimposing an additional, albeit temporary, bonus health bar onto the player so that any damage will first have to break through that supplementary HP before damaging the real one. As a balancing measure, they made it so shields couldn't stack, meaning if there were multiple shields on a single target, they would all take the same damage. I remember players complaining about this being a thing, but looking back, that would have been egregiously overpowered if you could layer shields on shields. In any case, shields had a certain benefit that may have just been entirely accidental from a coding perspective. When you get struck by an attack or strike enemies with an attack, on top of taking damage, the target also receives what is called poise damage. Poise is a hidden mechanic that determines whether you'll be staggered or knocked back by attacks. You know how sometimes when you get hit, you get stunned for a brief moment? That's what poise is. Weaker attacks generally don't stagger you, but stronger ones definitely do. Certain abilities grant stagger resistance, making you less likely to flinch from an attack, with Xingqiu being the most common example of this. He basically cuts the amount of poise damage you take by roughly a third, forcing enemies to attack you with something harder to actually knock you back. How this applies to shields is that due to shields absorbing the attack for you, the game recognizes, or rather I should say doesn't recognize, that you got hit by anything. Therefore it applies no poise damage. In other words, shields were given the accidental property of super armor, completely preventing you from being staggered while shielded because in the engine's eyes, it's as if you never got struck in the first place. This singular aspect is what makes shields vastly superior to heals throughout version 2, in conjunction with the aforementioned factors, mind you. Provided you had a big enough shield, you never had to concern yourself with avoiding enemy attacks, indirectly increasing your DPS as you wouldn't waste time or stamina dodging and weaving attacks. You could just stand there and face tank everything while bashing way through every boss, dungeon, or group of enemies that stood in your way. Honestly, it was just Zhongli. Having a decently built Zhongli on your team flat out negated the challenge of the game. His shield was so massive that even if you were face tanking everything, it could still remain intact by the time the skill came off cooldown, letting you go literal days or even weeks without so much as taking a single point of damage. To be clear, healers were still being used. It's not like they were shoved out of relevance, but with the increased abundance of overworld healing and the faster and more efficient clears in Spiral Abyss, healing drastically decreased in value for characters. The only ones who continued to find consistent use were those who provided offensive perks, namely Bennett, who was more sought out for his attack buff than regenerative capability, even if that was still useful. As a result, units who appeared to primarily focus on healing were seen as less valuable in the eyes of players. Jin, Chi-Chi, and Barba lost notable market share due to lacking sufficient increases in the offensive department, with Diona managing to hold on thanks to her role in freeze teams and offering shields of her own. This sentiment is ultimately what caused such a negative initial reception towards Kokomi, the first 5-star healing-oriented support to come out pretty much since the start of Genshin. Marketed to us as a battle healer, players expressed almost no interest in her restorative faculty, instead choosing to see how well she could stack up as an on-field attacker. Upon seeing her practical inability to critically strike, the reactionary response was to write her off as one of the worst 5-stars in the game. Not just her, but other healers that came out at the time like Sayu and Shinobu were discarded for having little, if anything else to offer besides healing, which at the time was at the bottom in terms of priority. It isn't that they had no use whatsoever, it's that circumstantially it wasn't good to just focus on that. Version 3 sought to equalize this a bit by setting a stage where trying to slot a shielder would be either impractical or straight up impossible. Everyone believes Dendro to have shaken up the meta from a DPS standpoint, and while it certainly has, it also shook things up in terms of supports. With the more element-stringent compositions that sprung up from his teams, it became increasingly harder to find room to put a shielder in like Zhongli. For instance, Nilou expressly forbade you from so much as having a character that wasn't Hydro or Dendro even present in your team, and with Hyperbloom necessitating 3 different elements, the likes of Zhongli and Toma could find little place in them. Coincidentally, we saw the rise of new units whose combination of healing property and element made them extremely valuable. Kokomi's Hydro element allowed her to find great usage in teams that needed some form of defensive capability in addition to elemental application. There was Taser before, but now Hyperbloom and Nilou Bloom. Bloom teams in particular were in need of healing due to Bloom cores having the chance to damage the player as well. Alongside Kokomi, Barba, Shinobu, and the newly added Yao Yao instantly became staples for Dendro teams, with the latter two almost contesting the Power 5 in usefulness. Shields were still going strong though. Double Hydro still had Zhongli as best in slot, and the advantages that shields had still made it the more efficient defensive option if and when you had the freedom to choose one or the other. At this point, healers were being used out of necessity, not by choice per se. When Baiju's banner came out, it was one of the lowest performing ones on record, indicating that while there has been a resurgence, healing is still an afterthought for most players. Either that or there are so many healers available that they thought Baiju was entirely superfluous. That being said, version 3 made a compelling argument that healers were coming back, and that sentiment came into full force in version 4. Fontaine's units placed heavy emphasis on using health not only as a form of survival but as a resource in and of itself. health manipulation became a widespread mechanic entering version 4, with several characters explicitly needing a healer who can restore lost HP and not a shielder who prevents further loss of it. I guess you can say the game got so easy that characters started hurting themselves to force you to bring a healer along. While the majority of them have the ability to recover themselves, that's only accounting for their own depletion, not the loss of health from taking damage. The official turning point for the healer vs shielder debate, however, would inarguably have to be Furina, creating such an enormous splash with her damage and support that she single-handedly elevated the status of healers from being nice to have to definitively more essential than shielders. Overnight, Jin, Baizhu, Yao Yao, Shinobu, Noelle, and Kokomi skyrocketed. One of the key aspects players are searching for in healers is what they could do alongside healing. For Shinobu, Yao Yao, and Kokomi, it was applying their respective elements. Same with Baizhu, in addition to him providing the super armor of shields. But none of them had the same kind of impact that Bennett provided, who was more of a buffer than a healer, frankly speaking. Furina basically gave that secondary aspect to them. She made all of them Bennett's if you think about it. Jin's an Animal Bennett thanks to Furina's mega damage boost. Baizhu and Yao Yao are Dendro Bennetts. Kokomi is a Hydro Bennett. Shinobu is an Electro Bennett. Obviously no one can actually be Bennett, but in the grand scheme of things, that's what Furina basically did for all healers, offered that supplementary effect, in this case being huge damage amplification for the team. That way, now they could also apply to other teams, which is one downside to having Zhongli, his inherent lack of synergy due to being Geo. Then shortly afterwards came the newest healer on the block, Xinyun, serving as a side grade to Jin or an upgrade depending on the type of playstyle you're opting for. Suffice to say, things have pulled a complete 180 for healers in Genshin. Understanding the shields had a notable advantage over healing through super armor, Hoyo endeavored to provide more functional incentives to healing, better reactability, more damage, and so on to make it more distinguished from one another. Healing is no longer just about recovering from damage, it's also about role consolidation, and now with version 4, driving damage through Furina. All in all, I like what they did with the healing class. Back in 2022, I complained a lot about how much better shielding was over healing and how I wish they balanced it better. I'm glad they followed through with it. Now I actually hope they would do the same for shielding. We've gotten a few shielders, the aforementioned Baizhu and then Kirara and Layla, but it would be nice to have a 5-star shielder besides Zhongli, just to spice things up. There is no longer concern for shields overtaking healing since health manipulation is a thing now, so even if we have more Zhonglis in the game, there will still be a need for healers to facilitate characters who fluctuate in health a lot. Personally, I think what they could do is make shields dedicated towards on-fielding teams, while heals are meant for quick swap teams. Shields would make the most sense for on-fielders who plan to stay out for extended periods of time, while heals are more useful for teams that repeatedly cycle through characters to deal damage instead. I know for Novelette teams that don't have C1 and or Furina, they like to pair up Zhongli with them, or sometimes I see Linny Monopyro field Zhongli instead of Kazuha for the final party slot, which implies players would rather have someone who can afford super armor for more consistency. But what do you guys think? Now that healers are sort of taking over the meta and shields appear to be dwindling, how would you find a balance of the two? Let me know in the comments down below. That's gonna be it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other discussion videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.